I was at a dinner party recently, and the host, a successful real estate investor, was just beaming. He was showing off a chart on his iPad, practically glowing as he bragged about how much his rental portfolio had appreciated in just the last few years. It's a gold mine, he said, pouring another glass of vintage wine. And he talked about market leverage and passive income with this giddy, almost childlike excitement. He was completely convinced that this upward trajectory was simply the reward for his brilliance. To him, the soaring numbers were proof that the system was working perfectly. But then the mood shifted. A younger guest quietly mentioned a new statistic. The median age for first-time homebuyers has now hit 40, and over 60% of recent graduates are effectively unemployed. In an instant, the host's smile just vanished. The brilliant investor turned defensive, almost aggressive. He started ranting about laziness and entitlement, dismissing an entire generation's economic suffocation as a simple character flaw. He couldn't see the connection between his soaring rents and their empty bank accounts. That sudden shift from celebrating the extraction of wealth to condemning those being extracted from was jarring. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a dangerous kind of blindness. It feels incredibly similar to the atmosphere in Athens around 600 BC. The elites then were doing the exact same thing, feasting on meat while the poor sip soup, completely unaware of a historical truth. When you insist on putting the people on the menu, eventually they don't just starve, they overturn the table. A shocking historical truth indeed. And the atmosphere in Athens around 600 BC offers a chilling blueprint for exactly how societies reach that breaking point. The deep dive we're taking today analyzes Solon's reforms, the political visionary often called the father of democracy, as a historical parallel for addressing contemporary social breakdown, or what sociologists call anomie, a profound loss of shared rules and social trust. We're looking at how a society reacts when elite institutions are widely perceived as prioritizing pure self-interest and, extraction over the foundational civic order.
That analogy of the table being overturned is just perfect. It's exactly the right frame. We have a fascinating set of perspectives here, drawing a direct line from Solon's urgent attempt to repair a broken social contract to modern critiques of narcissistic culture and the overreaching administrative state. This is a deep dive into recognizing the historical patterns of relentless self-interest and economic extraction that, time and again, fracture the foundational stability of a nation.
Right, and our mission today is to examine Solon's constitutional reforms, not just for what they achieved structurally, but for why they were so desperately necessary. We want to understand the contradictory legacy they left, especially when viewed through the lenses of sharp social critics like Christopher Lasch and Thomas Saz. Solon was voluntarily offered a tyranny and refused it.
He refused it, yes.
Yet the evidence suggests his actions and his rhetoric were nearly indistinguishable from those of nearby autocrats. So the real question is, does fixing a profound societal crisis always require a measure of tyranny?
To answer that, we absolutely have to start on the ground in early 6th century Athens. The city was a genuine pressure cooker. The situation was one of intense, paralyzing class warfare, known in Greek as stasis.
And stasis is not just like political disagreement, right? It's something much, much deeper.
Oh, much deeper. It's a complete societal failure. A breakdown so severe that the state is on the brink of an internal civil war.
And what drove this was absolute economic suffocation among the poor, centered entirely on land and debt. When we read the sources, the poverty is visceral. You, the listener, need to picture the hectomoroi.
The hectomoroi. It's a key term. It literally translates to the sixth parters.
Sixth parters.
Yes. And they weren't free farmers. They were sharecroppers, required to surrender 1/6 of their entire produce to the elite landowners, just for the privilege of working the soil.
So let's just pause on that. 1/6. Before you feed your family, before you save for the next season, a huge chunk is just gone.
It's gone. Imagine working all year, pouring your sweat into a patch of earth, and knowing that 16% of everything you grow belongs to a distant aristocrat. It's a structurally devastating system.
And the stakes were existential. The sources remind us that failure to pay that rent, or defaulting on any loan, especially in an economy where money was scarce and collateral, meant immediate consequences for your personal liberty.
Exactly. You were subject to seizure and debt slavery.
Which means what, exactly? They come take your farm tools.
Worse. They take you. Debtors could be enslaved right there in Attica, working for the person they owed money to. Or, and this is chilling, they could be sold abroad.
Sold abroad.
The cruelty of the extraction was so absolute that the sources mention those sold sometimes went so far that they could no longer even speak Attic, their native dialect.
Wow. So this wasn't just losing your property, it was losing your identity, your history, your language, and your family ties. It's a complete erasure of the person.
A total erasure. So what you have is a society fundamentally structured to result in the enslavement of the many, the vast majority of the population, to the few, the incredibly wealthy landowning elite.
This is the definition of a political powder keg. I mean, when you have an entire class of people whose very freedom depends on the whims of a handful of landlords, stability is impossible.
And that stability had already violently shattered. We absolutely can't contextualize Solon without understanding the failures that preceded him.
Which brings us to the Solonian conspiracy. This is around 632 BC.
Right. And this event truly highlighted how deep the instability went. Solon, who was an Olympic victor, a celebrity in his time.
So he had name recognition.
He had massive name recognition. And he leveraged that fame to attempt a coup d'etat to establish a tyranny. It failed, and Solon's followers sought religious sanctuary at the altar of Athena.
And this is where it gets really dark.
It does. The failure turned into a massive spiritual and political crisis. The magistrates promised clemency to the conspirators, but then the powerful and entrenched Alcmeonid clan, a family that would dominate Athenian politics for centuries, urged the magistrates to betray that promise.
They didn't just urge them, they impiously slaughtered Solon's followers.
They did. And there's this dramatic detail which must have just rocked the Athenian psyche. The conspirators had tied a braided thread from the statue of Athena Polias to themselves to ensure they remained under the goddess's protection.
Like a physical link to the divine.
Exactly. But then the thread snapped. The Alcmeonid leader, Megacles, instantly declared it an omen that Athena denied them suppliant rights, and the massacre began.
Just an unbelievable act of political cynicism and sacrilege.
That act, that blatant sacrilege, earned the entire Alcmeonid family a lingering blood curse. And this curse didn't stay abstract. It fueled violent feuds right in the streets and poisoned Athenian politics for generations.
So you had street violence, economic despair, and a profound spiritual crisis, all converging at once.
A perfect storm.
And the first response to this chaos was, well, not exactly nuanced. It was an attempt at order through extreme severity. Drakon's Code.
And we know the term draconian for a reason. Implemented after Solon's failure, the law code was unbelievably harsh.
How harsh are we talking?
Death. Death was the penalty not only for capital offenses like murder, but for shockingly minor offenses, including, some sources suggest, petty theft or even idleness.
So stealing a loaf of bread could get you executed.
That's the tradition, yes. This extreme severity was meant to impose stability, but it had the opposite effect. It just escalated the civil strife.
Of course, it made people desperate, seeing no difference between stealing a cabbage and murder if the penalty was the same. The law was just too harsh, too disproportionate to govern a fragile society teetering on the edge.
Exactly. And so into this cocktail of desperation, sacrilege, violence, and failed governance, Solon stepped in.
He was a fascinating figure, a poet, a traveling trader, someone of aristocratic background, but crucially moderate means. He wasn't one of the ultra-wealthy land barons.
No, and that position gave him a unique credibility. He was appointed as Dialex around 594 BC. This was a specific commission that made him a mediator or a special archon with extraordinary power.
And his mandate was singular?
Singular, addressed the toxic class warfare and the crippling inequities in land ownership.
But the crucial context here, and this goes right back to your opening anecdote, is why the elite had allowed the crisis to become so dire in the first place.
Right. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was broken by design, or at least by a fundamental shift in aristocratic priorities.
The sources highlight a demographic backdrop of population growth, which puts pressure on resources, but more fundamentally, a transformation of the ideology of game.
That's the key phrase. This is where we see that historical blueprint from modern extraction. The aristocrats shifted from a model of, reciprocal obligation.
Where they were expected to provide leadership, protection, patronage in exchange for their status and honor.
Exactly. They shifted from that to a purely transactional model focused on maximizing production and profit. They were actively seizing both private and public land and mercilessly exploiting the hectomori.
They became landlords first and civic leaders second, if at all.
If at all. And Solon, in his poetry, was explicit about this moral failure. He chastised citizens who were destroying the city out of sheer, unbridled desire for wealth and who grew rich through dishonorable means.
So he called them out directly.
He did. He recognized that the old terms of dependent arrangements, which had once offered at least a semblance of stability, had become so one-sided and so oppressive that they reached a breaking point.
The elite had prioritized their short-term profit over the long-term stability of the polis. They were feasting at the table while the masses were starving, entirely failing to see the inevitable consequence.
The table was about to be overturned.
So, Solon, standing in the rubble of economic suffocation and religious cursing, understood the foundational issue was economic. He needed an intervention so powerful it would reset the system without total revolution. This brings us to the most defining and radical action of his career.
That is the Sysaetheia, the shaking off of burdens. This was Solon's primary economic measure, and it was, just breathtaking in its scope for archaic Greece.
It had two revolutionary components.
Two. First, the absolute complete cancellation of all public and private debts.
Just gone. A clean slate, wiping the ledger clean across the entire Athenian society.
A total reset. And second, the immediate and non-negotiable abolition of debt slavery.
And this wasn't just a promise for the future.
No, it applied retroactively. It freed everyone who was currently serving as collateral, and critically, it required the state to fund the repatriation of those poor Athenians who had been sold abroad.
Imagine that. Imagine the logistics of searching the Mediterranean for your fellow citizens who had been enslaved for decades and bringing them home. The emotional impact must have been incredible.
The symbolic weight of this measure is almost impossible for us to grasp today. We mentioned the horoi earlier, the boundary stones.
Right, the markers that showed a mortgage or a claim on the land.
Or on the labor itself. The Sysaetheia meant physically removing these horois from the fields. Solon himself described this act, saying he freed the land which was formerly enslaved.
So it's a public, tangible, and visceral act of liberation. It announces to everyone, visually, that the entire economic relationship between landlord and farmer had been fundamentally severed.
It's a powerful statement. And you pointed out earlier that such radical debt cancellation and abolition of debt slavery were historically the policies of the most powerful autocratic rulers, tyrants or kings.
Like in Babylon or later with powerful Roman politicians.
Exactly. This shows Solon was operating with an authority far beyond that of a typical Athenian archon.
He was, but he deliberately stopped short of the full tyrannical package, and this is where his immediate efforts were, well, doomed.
The fatal flaw.
Yes, the fatal flaw. Solon refused to redistribute the land. Why? If you'd canceled the debts and freed the laborers, why not take the final step and give the newly freed citizens the means to sustain themselves?
Because historically, land redistribution was the defining and often most volatile action associated with a full revolutionary tyrant.
So he was afraid of the label.
He was terrified of the label, and he was terrified of the outcome. Solon's primary goal was stability, not pure economic equity. He feared that stripping the rich entirely of their land would guarantee the very civil war stasis he was trying to prevent.
So by taking this middle path, freeing the people from debt but leaving them landless, dependent on continued tenancy, he managed to ensure universal discontent.
Universal discontent. The rich lost their capital, which was the immense debt owed to them, and they hated him for it.
And the poor were freed, but they still had no secure means of livelihood, and they felt betrayed that he didn't deliver the land they truly needed.
So he was immediately trapped between two angry factions, which is perhaps the fate of all radical moderates.
Absolutely. But Solon was also a constitutional visionary. His reforms weren't just economic, they were political. And they really set Athens on the path away from aristocracy and toward democracy.
He instituted a Timocracy,
A system based on quantifiable agricultural wealth, shifting the basis of power from birthright to productivity.
which was revolutionary. It established the potential for social mobility based on individual effort or success.
So it's not about who your ancestors were, it's about what you can produce.
Exactly. He divided citizens into 4 distinct classes based on metamnoi, which are measures of grain, oil, or wine produced annually.
The highest class were the Pentacosiomedimnoi. They produced 500 or more measures. These were the super rich, eligible for the highest offices like the treasurers.
Next, you had the hippes, or knights, producing 300 or more measures. They could hold lesser magistracies.
Below them, the Zugatai, the yokemen, with 200 or more measures.
And finally, the thetes, everyone else who produced less than 200 measures. The thetes were the largest and poorest class.
So how did this actually create social mobility?
Well, while only the top 3 classes could hold the highest administrative offices, the crucial revolutionary element was that the classification was fluid. If a Zugites, or even a thete, worked hard, amassed property, or had a fantastic harvest.
They could theoretically cross that 200 or 300 measure line and become eligible for public office.
And that shattered the old aristocratic monopoly based on bloodline alone. It was a huge deal.
But the real democratic innovation, the one that truly changed the structure of Athenian power, was judicial.
Absolutely monumental. Solon introduced the right of appeal.
Unpack that for us. What does that mean in practice?
It means he opened the courts, the dicasteria, and crucially, introduced the right of appeal to the helia, the popular court. Before Solon, judgment was handed down by aristocratic magistrates, often arbitrarily or based on favoritism.
So if you were a poor farmer and a rich landowner accused you of something, you were basically out of luck.
Completely. But now, the poor, the thetes, had the right to appeal sentences and challenge the elite's interpretation of the law.
The sources, specifically the Athenian Politia, note that this action made the demos, the people, master of the vote, and consequently master of the Constitution. Why was judicial power so much more powerful than administrative power?
Because it gave the people the ultimate veto. If an aristocratic magistrate handed down a sentence, the demos could overturn it in court. This shifted ultimate legal authority away from the landowning elite and toward the general citizenry.
So it meant that laws had to be crafted and enforced with the popular will in mind.
Because the people were the final arbiters of justice. That's a fundamental power shift.
And Solon tried to ensure the civic engagement was widespread. He encouraged, and some sources even suggest he mandated, participation in the assembly.
Yes, there's a law attributed to him, which sounds extremely modern, punishing those who refuse to take part in crucial public decisions.
So no sitting on the sidelines.
No. He viewed civic duty as mandatory for the health of the polis. In times of stasis, remaining neutral was considered a betrayal of the city. He was essentially saying, if the civic house is burning, you can't stand idly by and claim ignorance or indifference.
But Solon was also pragmatic. He didn't just unleash the power of the demos. He implemented checks to prevent a kind of majority tyranny.
Yes, he is credited with creating the Council of 400, or the Bull.
And what was its function?
The Bull consisted of 100 members from each of the 4 ancient tribes. Its primary purpose was to vet and examine proposals before they were allowed to go to the popular assembly.
So it was a filter.
A filter, a stabilizer, a necessary friction in the constitutional machinery. It was a clear attempt to contain the boldness of the newly empowered people, preventing rapid, rash, or overly radical legislation from reaching the popular vote unchecked.
So we see Solon attempting to walk this impossibly fine line, freeing the enslaved, empowering the poor judicially, but checking them politically and refusing the one thing they truly wanted, lands.
He sought a middle path, designed to satisfy no one entirely, but ensure basic stability.
And as we know, it failed.
Spectacularly, at least in the short term. The sources confirm that the state dissolved once more into stasis immediately following his reforms.
Solon, overwhelmed by demands from both the rich to restore their debts and the poor to grant them land, effectively quit.
He took a decade-long sabbatical. He departed into exile, claiming his laws were fixed for 10 years and he wouldn't change them.
That's a massive political abdication. His foundational work, though crucial for the future of democracy, was unsuccessful in its immediate goal of ending the chaos.
The turmoil returned, and it led directly to the rise of Athens' first overt tyrant, Pisistratus.
Which is the ultimate irony, isn't it? Pisistratus later used Solon's laws, but enforced them through autocratic power to finally stabilize the state. Tyranny was required to implement the rules of the supposed father of democracy.
It's a deeply uncomfortable truth.
That irony, that the architect of liberty paved the way for tyranny, brings us to the most fascinating and controversial historical legacy of Solon. How he went to such great lengths to craft his public image. He employed methods and language that were, well, undeniably tyrannical, yet he somehow secured his reputation as one of the great sages.
It's a masterclass in political rebranding. It really is. Later generations, particularly the pro-democracy orators of the 4th century, elevated Solon to one of the canonical 7 sages, a philosopher, a poet, a wise lawgiver.
But to do that, they had to actively erase or, dismiss persistent historical traditions that painted him as a figure of autocratic power.
They had to smooth over the rough edges.
Yeah, and he was offered a tyranny. The sources are clear that the socioeconomic divide was so extreme, the stasis so violent, that many Athenians genuinely believed that tyranny, absolute rule, was the only way to cut through the legal mess and restore order.
Solon was acutely aware of this perception. His own denial of tyranny, which he enshrined in his poetry, became the central pillar of his public image.
Right. He stated explicitly that he refused to take absolute power, avoiding the implacable violence that would have defiled and disgraced his reputation.
He said he preferred to conquer men through wisdom and justice, not brute force. A very noble sentiment.
But if he abhorred tyranny so much, why did his actions, the debt cancellation, the sumptuary laws limiting aristocratic display, the repatriation of citizens, so closely match the policies of powerful tyrants nearby?
That's the core of the contradiction.
He was essentially denying the title while possessing the power.
Because he realized that to save the polis, he needed the unquestioned authority of a strong man, but without the eventual stigma that came with it. His poetic platform, which he used to justify his revolutionary actions, deployed rhetorical devices that were, at the time, common currency among rising archaic tyrants.
Okay, let's analyze that language. You're saying his critique of the elite is a good starting point. He was one of the first poets to politically weaponize the term koros.
Yes, koros. Originally, it just meant satiety, or having one's fill. It wasn't necessarily a negative word.
But Solon transformed it.
He transformed it in the political context into insatiability or greed. This was a brilliant move because it moralized the economic crisis. He argued that koros inevitably begets hubris, that excessive pride or arrogance, when great wealth follows men whose understanding is unfit.
That sounds like a prophet of civic virtue, a wise sage. But you're arguing it was a tyrannical trope.
It absolutely was. This specific critique of the wealthy elite's greed was a rhetorical tool widely used by demagogic leaders and tyrants across Greece to gain popular support.
So you paint the current ruling class as immoral, greedy, and unfit.
And you justify your own exceptional radical intervention. It's the language of populist revolution, which often precedes autocracy.
And then there's the most profound break with tradition. His claim to have united force and justice. Solon declared that he had joined force, be Dike of Baia, with justice, Dike.
In traditional epic Greek thought, Homer and Hesiod, Baia force and Dike justice, were opposing concepts. Justice was the slow, difficult work of the gods and law. Force was the arbitrary tool of heroes, or more often chaotic war.
So joining them was philosophically and politically radical. Why would a supposedly neutral mediator make that claim?
Because uniting Baia and Dike was exactly the platform tyrants used. People like the legendary Diaeses used it to gain popular support. They promised the demos that they would use decisive autocratic power to deliver swift, equitable judgments. Dike.
So Solon was claiming this fusion of autocratic strength and lawfulness. He was signaling that he was above the existing legal squabbles and possessed the authority to impose order decisively.
He did something similar with the language of honor. He declared, "To the people I gave so much privilege, geras, as to suffice."
Geras, that's the word for honor or a special portion.
Right, but in Greek epic tradition, geras is something given to kings and heroes by the gods or the assembly. It is not something received by the demos.
So by positioning himself as the unique giver of privilege, distributing only what he deemed sufficient,
He implied an autocratic power structure. He was not a facilitator of the demos' power, He was the source of it.
This sounds like a very carefully curated performance, and it all culminates in his famous self-description. The wolf simile.
The wolf simile. Solon described himself thus: "I stood as a wolf among many hounds."
Which is such a powerful image. What does it really mean?
It's a masterpiece of political ambiguity. A solitary wolf is highly unusual in Homeric poetry. Wolves hunt in packs. This solitary image suggests cunning, isolation, and crucially, great power.
Qualities historically associated with tyrants.
Exactly. Pindar, for instance, explicitly compared the justice of the tyrant Hieron to that of a wolf.
So he's embracing the strongman image. But why the hounds? Who are the hounds?
The hounds are his critics. They're the rich who lost their wealth and the poor who didn't get their land. By using this simile, he simultaneously portrays himself as the powerful, lone authority figure who's being unfairly attacked from all sides.
He created a narrative of persecution?
A perfect narrative of persecution.
Right.
I did the hard thing, the necessary thing, and now I'm being slandered and chased by the very people I saved.
And the strategy worked.
It worked brilliantly. By avoiding the title of tyrant while employing its methods and rhetoric, he secured his legacy as a misotyrannos, a tyrant hater. He ensured the necessary reforms were associated with wisdom, not violence.
The narrative here is chillingly consistent. When a social contract is broken by elite self-interest and extraction, the repair requires a level of authority that borders on autocracy. This notion of necessary, heavy-handed crisis management resonates powerfully when we look at modern critiques of institutional failure and the rise of what some scholars call the therapeutic state.
Absolutely. Solon diagnosed a society broken by elite self-interest and a foundational loss of justice. That diagnosis finds a profound echo in the work of Christopher Lasch, particularly his observations in the 70s and 80s on the deterioration of American culture into destructive narcissism.
And Lasch wasn't just talking about people being vain, he was talking about a systemic sociological decay.
Exactly. He saw a massive decline in public confidence and a pessimistic outlook, but he zeroed in on the disintegration of the family's core functions as the root cause of this narcissistic personality.
What were those functions he identified?
He identified two key losses. First, the loss of the family's productive functions, the material skills required to sustain the household. The family moved from being a producer unit to a consumer unit.
And the second?
The loss of reproductive functions, and he meant this in a social sense. Child-rearing, moral education, and transmitting cultural values, which became outsourced to other institutions.
So if the family loses its ability to instill skills and moral fortitude, it creates a vacuum. The sources drawing on Lasch suggest this didn't lead to individual strength, but to weakness, profound insecurity, and debilitating anxiety among parents and individuals.
And that vacuum, according to Lasch, was filled by the rise of expert institutions and the social service agencies, the state as therapist.
And these agencies, which were ostensibly meant to support or preserve the family,
paradoxically diminished its authority and its core capacity to function independently.
This dependency resulted in what Lasch called the de-skilling of parents. And we're talking about tangible historical examples here. Skills like teaching your own children, mediating minor disputes, passing on practical trade knowledge.
Were all externalized. Parenting became less about productive function and more about managing one's own emotional state, and you became reliant on external experts for everything from behavioral advice to educational structure.
And this externalization fostered self-preoccupation and emotional detachment. Individualism wasn't gained. Instead, reliance on the expert institutions meant individual integrity was lost.
And here's the parallel to Athens. Critics argue that just as the Athenian elite profited from debt slavery and land extraction, a modern elite, the therapeutic and professional class, benefits directly from this disintegration of family autonomy and individual integrity. Their existence depends on the continuation of dependency.
That notion of the state expanding its purview into areas traditionally held by the individual or the family is captured perfectly by Thomas Szasz' concept of the therapeutic state.
Szasz, a psychiatrist himself, was a tireless critic of his own profession. He defined the therapeutic state as the collaboration between psychiatry and the state to repress disapproved actions and thoughts through compulsory medical interventions.
His argument was radical. He contended that terms like mental illness are often just social constructs.
Right, that they aren't descriptions of biological disease, but rather ethical and social judgments of behavior viewed with disdain by authorities.
Can you give an example?
Well, he pointed to the shift from viewing sadness as a normal human reaction to loss or failure to pathologizing it as depression. He argued that labeling distress after a major event as post-traumatic stress disorder or shyness as a social anxiety disorder transforms moral struggles or social discomforts into medical diseases that require state intervention.
This is a profound shift from the old state structures. The nanny state of the past was austere and punitive. It told people what they couldn't do.
Szasz argued that the therapeutic state, while appearing compassionate and supportive, is ultimately even more authoritarian.
Why more authoritarian?
Precisely. Because it dictates not just external actions, but what people should feel and think. This is a much deeper intrusion into personal sovereignty than economic debt ever was. When the state takes over the moral landscape, the coercion becomes medicalized.
The most frightening manifestation of this medicalized control is the deprivation of liberty practices like involuntary commitment or sectioning and forced medication.
Szasz viewed these as a medicalized deprivation of liberty, arguing that the state has no right to forcibly intervene if the individual poses no danger to others.
So his argument was fundamentally about sovereignty over the self.
Absolutely. He rejected the premise that the state must forcibly protect our health, arguing that this is just as tyrannical as the state forcing you to adopt certain religious beliefs. In the therapeutic state, the individual loses custody of themselves to the expert.
Echoing the way the hectomoroi lost custody of their labor and their very bodies to the aristocratic landowner.
It's the same pattern of dependency and extraction, just in a different domain.
So when we link this back to Solon, the parallel is inescapable. Solon was forced to assume quasi-autocratic powers uniting force and justice to solve a crisis of economic oppression and social decay caused by elite extraction.
And in our modern context, critics argue that when the crisis manifests as psychological enemy and institutional failure, the solution offered is an authoritarian, therapeutic authority.
An authority that trades the old oppression economic debt for a new form of absolute control over the individual's inner life and capacity for self-determination.
The deep dive into Solon really reveals a crucial pattern: the fragility of a society built on unchecked extraction. Solon's crisis was triggered by elites who destroyed the civic order by prioritizing their own wealth accumulation and creating widespread dependency among the populace.
And his attempt to repair that broken civic order required an authority so absolute that it had to mimic the policies of nearby tyrannies: the radical debt cancellation, the sumptuary laws, the public assertion of a unified force and justice.
The enduring dilemma Solon faced illustrates the profound difficulty of repairing a fundamental societal fracture without sacrificing a measure of individual liberty or adopting a form of autocratic, centralized control.
He tried to stand as the horos, the boundary stone between the armies of the rich and the poor, yet his middle path satisfied no one and led to renewed stasis.
The tension remains relevant, whether crisis-era intervention political, like Solon's use of forced stability, or modern institutional, like the therapeutic state's mandated care.
Inevitably trades one form of personal oppression, be it economic debt, for another form of absolute control, such as institutional dependency and mandated moral or psychological conformity.
When you strip away the philosophical gloss that was later applied to his legacy, Solon reveals himself as a man who, in order to save the polis, had to employ methods that required him to be a tyrant in all but name.
By doing so, he guaranteed that his legacy was exactly what he wanted it to be, that of a persecuted political visionary. He ensured that when Athens finally embraced democracy, the necessary social reform was associated with wisdom and justice, guaranteeing that the violence of the wolf remained hidden beneath the image of the sage.